Hello. Well, I am Simoneta Negrete indeed, and I am glad I disappeared from there. I will talk a little bit about land use legacies and also about agrodiversity from the below ground perspective. We have been carrying on now for more than 10 years work in a biosphere reserve called Los Tuxtlas that many of you might have heard of. It's the most northern limit of the tropical forest in America. It is a very tropical place, so I hope you enjoy this. Oh, that looks ugly. Well, that is an old photograph. Well, yeah, old now. It's a 2004 photograph. And in the contour, you will see where the forest used to be in 1972. And in green, I hope you'll see what the forest cover looked like within the reserve in 2004. So even if it is a biosphere reserve, the forest cover continues to diminish. And why is that so? Because agriculture is actively going on and it has changed. So we have studied this, how things have changed in agriculture. Now I have to apologize for those that were in my education session, because there are a couple of slides that are the same, but for the sake of the rest of people, I will repeat a little bit, but just a little bit. So what happened in the area? This is an indigenous area where Popoluca people live, and before the 1930s, in the first little map, you'll see how agriculture was performed in a very large scale, and this means not that everything was covered with agriculture, but you could put your small plot anywhere, and it migrated. So there was no property. It was just a community, or a community at large property. But then the revolution came, the land was given to small towns in the form of communal land, but smaller communal land, and then it fragmented. So the way you could perform agriculture was in a much smaller spatial scale. You still could rotate within that as much as you like, but then this sort of promoted the idea of more individual land property. And what happened is that naturally, socially, culturally, as you can see in the last map, the inhabitants of each town divided up into now family-owned plots. So we say that the polycultures sedentarized, so they become permanent in the same spot. So the management decisions reduced in three scales. Space, from 46,000 hectares what you could choose from to less than 20. Agricultural cycles, of course, diminished. So if you could rotate to the same place in 20 years, now you're doing it in 5 years. And the diversity, which is something that we will be very interested today in, diminished completely from 40 species within one polyculture to 3 or less today. Population grew a lot, as you can see. And during the time that land was given, or property was given to the different places, you can see, that, for example, in the first graph, that the number of hectares given to each community diminished with time. The process of land granting lasted for very many years, from the 30s to the 90s. And obviously, we ran out of land, so the amount of land per community was smaller. The number of hectares per person also diminished. And also, interestingly enough, the bureaucratic time that it took from asking for granting until it was granted diminished incredibly as well. So more rapidly land was being granted with time. what are the consequences for soil biologists? Yeah, but why are you talking about this? Well, one of the things that we were interested in, and I'm just going to go back here a little bit. This is an excellent scenario to see what the land history. There is a land history mosaic in the area, which is not very common in the Northern Hemisphere. There is all sorts of land histories in each plot. So this is a perfect scenario to start tearing apart the effects of current land use and land use history. You can see in the histogram that there are plots that were fell before the 1960s and plots that were fell very recently, and their histories are very varied. So we did a variance petitioning exercise where we tried to tear apart the effect of landscape, the effect of current land use, dividing up land uses into what the current land uses are, as you can see them there, like coffee, forest, maize slash and burn, and mucuna, palm, pasture, secondary, tree plantations. There's a huge variety of land uses today, and land use history. So what happened in the last 70 years that agriculture was performed? So we used as variables time since it was fell, and time is spent under pasture, under maize, or under agroforestry as the variables to explain what's going on in the soil. So now we're going into the soil. There were some interesting patterns. For example, while clay seems to be fairly constant, these are clay soils, litter mass, in general, for every current land use, diminished with the time that it was fell. So we're losing organic matter, regardless of what we're using the places for. The content of magnesium diminished, and the interesting thing is, and I need you to remember this, arbuscular mycorrhizal species increased with the time that plots had spent in their history under maize cultivation. These are a bit more complex. These are the interactions between two historical land use characteristics. Both involve time that the plots have spent as maize, interacting with the time since the plots were fell. Why do we have half tissues? We have half tissues because you cannot have more time as maize than the time that the plot was fell. So half doesn't make sense, so we only have half a graph. So let's start with the one in the left. The percent of sand decreases more rapidly for those plots that had spent more of its time as maize. And why is that so? Because they are being eroded. On the right, nitrogen-fixing bacteria have the opposite trend. The more time you spend as maize, as a plot, in the time that you've been fell, more species of nitrogen-fixing bacteria you will find. So remember this second one as well. So, from the land uses that we studied, which ones are the more worrying ones? We did just a standard PCA with all the variables that you can think of that can tell you about how well a soil is doing. These may include, I don't know if you can see anything, but there is pH, Ca, Mg, organic matter, density, dehydrogenase activity, glucosidase activity, phosphorus, everything, nitrogen availability, many variables that will tell you how the soil is doing. And then we plotted our places. And as you can see, forests are down here. So these are the more fertile places because they're forests. And then there in the middle, surprisingly, not very much, but a bit surprisingly, are pastures. So pastures are not doing that bad. And mixed within them are agroforestry places. Don't imagine very nice, beautiful agroforestry places. There are some very nasty plantations there, so it is very varied. It includes coffee as well, so it is a lump that it's not a very homogeneous lump. But just I want you to see here, milpas. It's what's feeding people in this area, and in 70% of Mexico, food security depends on polyculture milpas that are family-based. And these are doing worse in the space of fertility. Not surprisingly, in the area, you have maize productivity for the state. Veracruz state is where we are. And these are productivity reports in a historical literature research for the area. And this arrow represents when fertilization and new sort of technological packages were introduced to try and deter productivity reductions. And as you can see, at best, they have done nothing for that matter. So what's going on with the soil? Well, just quickly, you have colors here for sort of categories of nutrients, and I just want you to see that as many tropical places, phosphorus is very deficient. So mostly what happens in this area is you have phosphorus, you produce, you don't produce. These are the polyculture milpas, and this is how they used to be, and some still are, but very few. About 40 products with maize, beans, and squash as well. We devised a project to determine what's going on below ground with the reduction of species richness, bean diversity, and maize diversity. And we focused on nitrogen-fixing bacteria because we saw evidence that these were interesting groups, and avascular mycorrhizal fungi. So let's start with species richness. Okay. This is interesting because, as you can see, the colonization of the percent of colonization of avascular mycorrhizal fungi increased in greenhouse experimental maize plants when they were exposed to soils from milpas that had different number of crops with maize. So in the pots, the maize was alone, but the soil that it was planted in came from milpas that had different diversity richness, well, agrodiversity or species richness. Also, phosphorus available in those soils is very much higher in those milpas that have more than 8 species associated with maize. And this occurs only in the flowering time, when maize needs most of its phosphorus because it is going to fructify. So, what about maize diversity? Mexico is the center of origin of maize. Maize originated in Mexico and diversified in Mexico and continues to diversify in Mexico. So it is a huge worry for us what's going to happen, and it's happening with maize. But what's happening with the diversity, the relationship between the diversity of maize and the diversity of below ground? This is what we've got. Can we say that we have adaptation of local land races to phosphorus deficiency? Well, in this experiment that we performed, we realized that you can see the arrows have colors for maize colors except the green one, which is the CIMIT introduced improved variety. And this is avascular mycorrhizal colonization against shoot phosphorus obtained by a potted plant. And so, you know, the more colonization you've got, the much shoot phosphorus you have. But there is a winner, which is the black maize. It performs much better than the rest. And it does in high phosphorus, which is not very high, it's just what a little bit of fertilization does, and low phosphorus. So it's able to do, this is no fertilization, and this is a little bit of fertilization. And it does really well in both situations. And in terms of root phosphorus, it's interesting because this effect is not that clear. So phosphorus is being obtained, and it is associated with colonization, but it is not retained in the roots. It is going to the shoots. I want you to see this in particular because this is a vascular mycorrhizal fungus dependency for phosphorus intake. And these are the land races. And the interesting things are, under low phosphorus and high phosphorus, the black maize, it's not very dependent. It is dependent, but not very dependent. But this one is very dependent, which is the introduced one, and it's not obtaining much phosphorus, even if it's dependent. So, who is with who? Well, black maize is with the more taxonomic units, so it's interesting. And maize and beans. We have 3 types of beans. One of them is as good as the winner in Mexico. And not everyone is able to associate with as many rhizobial strands as this particular maize, which is a very, this particular bean, which is a very promiscuous one, this one here. Okay? So not every bean is as good as every other bean in associating with diversity in the soil. And that one that is very efficient at obtaining nitrogen, it's actually the one that also has more diversity of rhizobia. So, summing up, because the red light is there, sorry. Land use history matters. That's one of my messages. I hope I have convinced you that in tropical landscapes, agrarian reforms and post-revolutionary land granting generated a diversity of land use histories that should be considered if soil fertility and functioning are to be understood. Management should be targeted to phosphorus. Like in many tropical soils, the most limiting nutrient in this milpas is phosphorus, and fertilizers used are not designed to solve this problem. And agrodiversity matters for our vascular mycorrhizal fungi and for nitrogen-fixing bacteria, because not everyone is being able to associate with everyone. So, above below ground identity preferences. There is a relationship, not strict, but there is one, between the plant species and varieties and the identity of their symbionts. So conserving agrodiversity, it is important, and that's the message that we're trying to communicate through this type of material to producers. So I just want to thank the below ground biodiversity group and project for providing data and financing part of this research, and to the Biopop project which followed, and to the producers, and from all of us in Biopop, thank you.
Thank you. Now we have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you for your nice presentation. I thought I heard you say in the beginning that decreased diversity in an agroecosystem, so a system that might be dominated by maize, had increased diversity of rhizobia, or nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Was that correct?
No, I think I was not clear enough. The more time your plot has spent in its history under maize, there are more nitrogen-fixing bacterial species. So it's the opposite.
So it's more in abundance.
Yes.
Okay, because there are many studies that have shown that if you have an increased above-ground diversity, especially of legumes in the cropping history, you will have an increased diversity below ground of those rhizobia. And it seems like, we went through them rather quickly, but I just wanted to make sure I understood that that was what they found.
It's completely consistent with that. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
One more question? Thank you. You told about maize cultivar diversity, and you show that black maize was associated with more mycorrhiza. My question is there a strong selection of yellow maize? Is black maize less selected than other varieties? You see what I mean? It has been selected more recently or less? Sorry,
do you mean selected for eating? Or selected in the sense of selecting the seeds? Or?
Yes, selecting the seeds. It is an old variety or a recent variety? And because some people say that old varieties are more associated with soil organism. They benefit more from soil organism than new varieties. And it is true for maize.
I don't know is the answer, but what we know from here is that, as far as we understand, but nobody has demonstrated that, except the maize variety Texcoco that was introduced by CIMMYT, all the rest were locally developed by these people in 2,000 years of agriculture. And this means we selected, I didn't say that because this is so huge that I was overrun by the time, but there are about, they have, identified about 20 maize varieties in this Popoluca group. We selected the most common one, which is red, white, yellow, and black. But there are tons more, and it is because they have been selected them for different uses for very many centuries. So I would say, but not with evidence, that they are all very old.